Hello again. Okay, this short video, well, we'll see how short it is, but it's intended to be short, will focus on just setting up an activity within peerScholar. So let's not mess around, let's get right into it. So I'm just going to go into a course I have. Mine happens to be called Pre-Launch Testing. It has a bunch of activities already in it because we've been testing, but I'm just going to use this as a shell to walk you through the process of how to actually create an activity for your course, some of the things you might want to think about when you're doing that. So the first step is simply to click on the Add Activity button, give your activity a title, anything you want. Alright, and that will bring you into this sort of wizard kind of thing. And as you see across the top, there's essentially 5 steps that you can take, although this last step is completely optional. So we will just go through those 5 steps really quickly. The first step, you've already really begun by entering the title. That's the title, and that's really all you need for this step. But you can choose to add a little description. This is the first activity for my etc, etc, etc. And you can also add some tags. So maybe this is for introductory psychology. Maybe it's something I use to enhance critical thinking. And maybe it's focused on animal research, something like that. So I can add any tags I want. The purpose of all of this, well, the description is kind of to remind you, but also to potentially remind others or inform others what your activity is about, because you can share activities. And when you share activities in a library, you can choose to share them with your colleagues or in fact with the world. And this information that you're adding here will allow others to find your activity. So maybe they're looking for a critical thinking activity that fits introductory psychology. So if they happen to use those search terms, they will come across your activity, etc. So it's really just giving some information that defines your activity a little better and allows others to find it if you're thinking of sharing. Now, you notice at the bottom here, there's something called activity type. As we continue to evolve peerScholar, you will see many activity types there, but right now we have 2. We have a classic activity type and one that we're calling case study because that's the most common use case. I'm not going to talk about the case study application right now. I'm going to create a separate video for that. Let me just though give you a taste. What it allows you to do is to group students into separate groups and then control the way those groups peer assess one another. So if you think that's something that you may want to do, then check out the video that's focused on the case study approach. I'm going to stick to the classic. The classic implies that every student is working as sort of an independent unit. They're all going to submit something and then they're all going to review a set of their peers. And so it's sort of individual on individual. Okay, that's the classic activity. All right, so that's all we have to do for the first step. And now these next 3 steps relate to the 3 phases of a peerScholar activity. So students, once again, are going to first log into the create phase and create something. Then they're going to log into the assess phase to assess the work of their peers. And then finally, they're going to log into the reflect phase to at least see the constructive feedback that their peers gave to them, potentially to assess it and potentially even to revise their work in light of that feedback. So really what we're going to do now is just visit each of these phases in turn and give some more specific information about what we would like, how we would like that phase set up. All right, so let's just jump right in. Create phase. Create phase is very straightforward. You just need to provide students with some instructions. So I'm going to suggest to you that a peerScholar activity is kind of really 2 activities in one. There is whatever task you want to assign your students, and that's the part you're going to define here. So just like you would have in the past, if you said, you know, your task here is to do some research on related to the ethics of animal research and to form and argue a specific opinion etc. So whatever you want students to do, you describe it. You can embed all sorts of things here, including, by the way, things like, well, video. If you want to embed a video, if you have a link, so let's say we were at youtube.com and we love this band called the freaking Lolas. I've heard they're amazing. You should check them out. And so oh wow, that looks a little bit like me. That's kind of weird, but maybe we want to grab that URL, and we want all of our students to watch that and react to it in some way. Now, of course, in the current context, you'd probably rather they watch something about the animal ethics, but the point here is you can embed any kind of multimedia you want using the buttons in the browser, video, images. You can highlight text in certain ways, etc. Play with the text color, exactly. So that's it. You can also, if you want, have extra resources as attachments. So one common example here might be, and I've used this before, so it's already in my media, you might want to do something like an argument rubric. And so that's just an attachment. If you click on it, you'll see what it is in another window. But now what students, when they log in, and in fact, let me highlight this, we have the preview here. When they log in, what they will see is your instructions as you've described them and any attachments you've provided, and that will guide them on what they do. And then as set up so far, this is where they will write if you're asking them to write something, or attach digital media if you want them to attach something. Now you have a little bit of control over some of these. So let me close this for a second and show you that. You see submission options here. You don't need to touch them, but if you do, you can play with things like, do you want that text box on the side? Notice that if I turn that off, now below, all there is the attachment option. So all students can do now is attach some digital product. But if I turn that on, that box will be there. In fact, I might not want attachments. So in this case, all students see is the text box to write their composition in. They don't actually see the attachments option. So if you don't want them attaching things, you can toggle that off. You can also set a word limit, and this distinction between hard or soft, think of hard as Twitter. So this would literally say once they get to that 250th word, they're not going to be able to write another word. And so they're going to have to do that Twitter thing of trying to get rid of words if they want to add some. If you turn the hard limit off, it will allow them to write more than 250, but it will not allow them to save until they get their text down to 250. And let me just highlight this as well. You see up in the corner of the composition as they write. Okay, yes, there we go. As they write, you see the word count increase over here. So if it's a soft one, they could do a 300-worder first or a 400-worder and then find ways of bringing that down to 250, but they'll have to get it down to 250 before it will actually allow them to save. Okay, that's pretty much it to the create phase. All fine. So what I'm going to do now is just say, okay, let's continue on to the next phase. Next phase is assess. Okay, so I mentioned peerScholar activities are kind of two activities in one. To create whatever you ask them to do. The next two phases really relate to that second activity, and that second activity is actually pretty consistent across all peerScholar uses. It involves giving your peers constructive feedback. That's what the assess phase is about. And then ultimately using that constructive feedback that you receive in some way. Maybe just reading it, but maybe doing things. And that's what we're going to define. So this is all about giving feedback and using feedback. Because it's consistent, that allows us to do some things to save you time, as I will show. But let's first of all just say, number of peers, this is the first question. When a student logs on and they're going to see some of their peers' work, how many peer compositions do you want them to assess? Okay, now let me highlight a trade-off here. How long is that composition? Are they assessing, short one-page argument pieces, or are they assessing 30-page draft thesis documents. If they're assessing something pretty long, you probably shouldn't ask them to assess too many of them. But if it's something short, you can ask them to assess more. I like more because it's the process of assessment that engages critical thought and has them comparing these different compositions, trying to figure out what makes one better than another, and then ultimately trying to express that. So that's where a lot of the bang for the buck goes. So for what it's worth, my preferred use case involves having shorter compositions, but then asking them to assess. In my case, I ask them to assess typically six of their peers. But again, that's just a suggestion. You can choose whatever you wish here. So let's say 3 for now. So I'm going to ask them to assess 3 peers. Now, you now need to define the assessment. Okay, so they're going to see 3 of their peers' work now, and well, what do you want them to do with it? So I'm going to introduce you now to this toolbox that you will see all through the peerScholar application. So if I press this plus, we will see these 8 tools, and these are different assessment devices. So the idea here is a student is looking at peer 1's work, but now you want them to react to it in some way. What do you want them to do? So it could be something as simple as, give an overall grade. Well, let's call it rating. Grade is such a charged word. Of this work out of, well, what do you want it out of? Let's say 15. Well, if I want it out of 15, I can change that to 15. By the way, below is an example of sort of what the students would see. And now I have a couple of other decisions. Do I want the minimum value to be 0 or 1? And do I want to restrict them to using whole numbers, or do I think I'm okay if they enter 10.5, let's say? Is that cool? So if I don't check that off, then they can enter these decimal numbers. But if I do check it off, you notice that it balked. It would only allow 10, and it won't. Oh, yeah, see, it won't allow decimal numbers. All right, so that's one of your tools, simple point scale, and you see it kind of populated up here. You could obviously ask things that are more related to the rubric. So if I showed you that rubric, notice that it had 3 things worth 40, 40, and 20. So purpose, elaboration, and convention. So we could instead say, okay, I want to focus on the purpose. It was worth 40%. So maybe I'll use a linear scale and I'll call it purpose. I'll expect them to read the rubric and find out what that is. And okay, now I only want this out of 4 because it's 40%. So they're just going to give it a 1, a 2, or 3, or a 4 in terms of the purpose. And I can even, like for example, the rubric, did it have clear, fully sustained and purposefully focused? Okay, so if that's the verbiage they use there, we could use that clearly focused. They didn't tend to use a negative version of that, but we could say really unfocused or something like that. And now you see people will be able to choose where they want to rate this work. We could do that for the 3 facets of the rubric and really have them relying to the rubric. By the way, we also have this, if you're a rubric fan, we also have this matrix tool where you could, maybe this is, really bad, kind of bad. Okay, and we can add more of these. Okay, good, really good. And then we could maybe have facet 1, facet 2, and we can add more, facet 3. So I mean, these would say something like that, purpose, elaboration, or whatever. And then what the students will end up seeing is something like this, and they will be asked to rate these facets according to, okay, that won't happen in the real tool. Oh, it's because of the valid prompt. It's upset with me about my prompt. Okay, cool, fine. So please rate this work according to the attached rubric, etc. And so that's just adding that title to their work. Okay, so that's a nice tool if you're a rubric kind of person, etc. By the way, you can move these things around once you create them any way you want. Another one that I'll highlight is the comment, because this is usually the core. So, you know, please highlight something about this work that, if changed, might make it much better. What sorts of changes should the author consider? So this is just you know, a prompt to promote constructive feedback, etc. And so this is just going to prompt them in an open-ended way to add that. So just to make this concrete, let me jump down to the preview to show you what we've kind of created so far. We have the instructions. I'm going to get to the instructions in just a second. The resources, by the way, are those same resources from the create phase. They're always present. If you ever want to you know, make these instructions disappear for a second, this just allows you to have those come or go as you wish. But this is the core of what we've done so far, where we've got the different peers, and so you can't see any peer work now, but this would have, you know, whatever peer 1 submitted, whatever peer 2 submitted. So as they go through these, that would happen, and this would be the matrix that we set up where they could do ratings, etc. Right, including all the way down to the comment. So this gives you a good sense of what you're creating. Now you'll notice there's a self-assess here. Let me just say that I already highlighted a lot of the power that comes out of peer assessment, that it pushes students to think critically and to express their critical thoughts in clear, effective communication, constructive feedback, all that kind of thing. There's something else very powerful going on here too. As students are seeing exemplars of their peers' work, they can't help but think about their own work, right? They're getting clear examples of people who are doing things perhaps better than they are and perhaps worse than they are. And so every example gives the student a good sense of where their work fits. This is something we often, you know, it's an opportunity we don't let students often see. How is my work comparing to those around me? If you use self-assessments, you can kind of ramp this up a little bit more. So this is, you know, something called metacognition, understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, the quality of your own work. So if you really want to give the students even more structured kind of experience with metacognition, you can ask them to self-assess. So that's the little flip here. And so what that means is after they assess their peers, they will then be asked to assess themselves. And when you set this up, you can set it up so that they're doing they're using the exact same peer assessments that we just set up over there. But you can also, if you wish, so this will be the default where it uses, so they assess themselves exactly like they assess their peers. But if you want, you can do things like saying, well, I don't really want them to do this one when they assess their peers, but I want to add other things. So if we actually want to edit the assessments rather, we can do so here. So we'll get rid of the use existing because you can't edit along. So maybe we'd say, you know, forget about this purpose thing. I don't want that. Forget about them giving themselves a mark, but we might want them to do something like, what is this, or list 3 weaknesses you've seen in your own work, whatever, blah, 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 blah. So we can do that. And now what we end up with is the self-assessment is different than the peer assessment. And again, if we kind of sneak down here and preview that, and I'm going to minimize those instructions, you will see that when it's their peers, they're seeing that same assessment thing over here, but when they get to themselves, it's a different assessment than it was with their peers. Okay, so here's the 3 weaknesses, for example, and there's fewer things there. Okay, so you get the idea of that, I hope. So you can choose to have the self-assessments or not. I suggest that you include them. Research suggests that including them is a really good thing to do to help your students develop their skills. Now, because it's kind of limited, I mean, that's really most of what you have to do. Although, well, I mean, let's look at some of your options. You do have these options as well. Allow an annotations. Let me just show you what that is. So let's scoot back to preview. So when it's annotations, I hope I can do this with it. Yeah. So if there's pure work over here, I can say this is not a sentence, let's say, and save. So when you allow annotations, students, in addition to doing this formal assessment that you've defined, they can do this lower level for grammar or reference citing or sentence structure, or, you know, this is not a very good first sentence to a paragraph, etc. They can make these lower level notes if you allow annotation. So the question is, do you want that to be possible? If so, you flip that on. Do you want students to be able to add attachments to their assessment? There are situations where you might, usually you don't, but if you do, you do that. And again, you will just see, and this is a good, by the way, you see me just kind of flipping to this thing here. So now they can attach files. So the preview is always, as you're doing this and getting used to stuff, flip to the preview every now and then to see what you've done. Okay, so now let me get to the instructions. One thing you'll notice is we've already done the instructions for you for this phase. And that's because, again, the task that students are asked to do tends to be pretty consistent across peerScholar activities. And so we've just kind of provided instructions that guide them through the task. And we've also made these instructions sensitive to the options you've chosen. So let me make that make sense to you. As we're going through, let's just start here. I'm saying, okay, to the right of the peer compositions, or below if you're using a mobile device, you'll see the assessment form that your instructor has specified you to use. So I'm saying read the compositions, fill out the assessment form peer by peer. Now look at this part. It says, that part, wow, that's a big part. This part, you will, that's not very nice. You will, whatever. Let's go to the part that starts with you. I'm not sure why it's highlighting the whole paragraph, but you will notice that the last peer is you. Yes, now that you have seen and thought about the work of your peers, look again at your own work and assess yourself. All of that shows up if you have self-assessment on. If you have self-assessment off, all of that just disappeared. So now it's just saying go through the peers. So we've made the instructions sensitive to the settings that you chose so that your students will be instructed on a process that fits the features you choose. So the idea here is, I mean, if you read through and you like these instructions, you need not change them at all. You can just use them as there is, but of course, if you want to, you can go ahead and edit as you like and make them your own. All right, that's it for the assess phase. Let's say continue. So we've set up the task, we've set up the assessment. Now, reflect phase. Reflect phase is quite easy to do. You really have three choices to consider with the assess phase. So if the minimum, so I'm gonna flip this off and I'm gonna flip this off. So the minimum then is when students log into the assess phase, they see the comments that their peers have attached to their own work. So they can go, heck, let's preview. I'm going to minimize these instructions again. They can go peer by peer, and there's nothing to see here right now. But what they would be seeing is here's their composition, and when we click on peer 1, if peer 1 gave any inline comments, they would see those in yellow, as I showed you, so they could mouse over and see what peer 1 said. And in the assessment form, they would see the ratings that peer 1 gave them. And of course, it's anonymous, and so, you know, all they know are these are the ratings, these are the comments, etc. So at the minimum, they can go peer by peer and they can see what that feedback was. Okay, so that's kind of the traditional. You hand in an essay, you come back and you get some feedback. But here are some things that allow you to really ramp up the educational power of that feedback. First thing is ask them to assess it. So in some way, ask them to look at the feedback and do some form of analysis of it. Our default is a very simple one. It's around usefulness. So we kind of ask them a question. Okay, this student was supposed to be giving you constructive feedback. They were supposed to be telling you ways your work could be better. If you listen to what they said, Do you think your work would be better? If you do, then those are useful comments. If you don't, then they're not useful. So what we've got here is just a very simple multiple choice. I'll just show you a little more specifically what it is. It would look like this down here. How useful is this with respect to helping you improve your future work? And it's just a very simple, you rate it as useful, not useful, or very useful. All there is to it. Now, your whole toolbox is available to you. Same toolbox as before. So if you would like to make this assessment of feedback much more rich and complex, you can do so as you like, using any of these tools. Okay, so that's one thing that's really cool. Get them to assess the feedback. A nice thing about this, by the way, it's two things. First of all, it has them analyzing the feedback in a more structured way, and you have control over that now. You can guide them through how they analyze the feedback. The other important thing, though, is that they know that their feedback is being assessed by peers. And that knowledge that those peers will be providing some sort of assessment of their feedback tends to make students give more conscientious feedback. They think about it more and they give more useful comments. And so this sort of makes the whole engine of this process even more powerful. So because of that, our minimum recommendation is, at the very least, show them the feedback and ask them to assess it. Now, if you have the time and the resources and it fits your educational situation, you can also ask them to revise and resubmit on the basis of that feedback. And so this is very simple. So now the way we have it set up, they read the feedback, they assess each piece, and then they're basically told, okay, go back to the text box. And revise your work. Use that feedback to make it better. And that's called formative assessment, formative revision. And that's how the students get the most out of the feedback, by really trying to use it and figure out how to use it. So it requires a lot of creative thought. Once again, they're exercising all their communication skills here, and they're trying to incorporate that feedback effectively. Okay, so you can ask them to do those three things. And that's really all there is to the reflect phase. I will say the instruction story is the same as it was before. We've auto-generated the instructions for you. If you like them, then cool, leave them as they are. And again, it's sensitive to the features you picked. If you don't like them, change them. Up to you. But you can just say, yep, that's good, and you're done. Okay. I forgot. I'm going to go back. So let me just show you right now. If you want to edit an activity that you've created, that little pencil over here is the edit. So I did save and close, and that said, okay, you're done everything. And it took me to this activity dash that I'll show you in a moment. But I also wanted to show you this last step that you can choose to add or not. And that's what we call additional assessments. So what this is, it's very simple. You can just create some assessments, any assessment you want, using that actual toolbox. And let me just create a simple point scale. And then you can choose to have these happen after everything else in whatever phase you want. So this is really great if you want to ask your students some questions about what they just did. So you can come up with various questions. And so the way this will work is, let's say they just did the assess phase and they did everything I told you before. Then when they press save, another question will come up in a light box over top of everything. And it'll be this question that I set up. So it's good if you want to do research on what's going on, or if you just want to be reflective, something to play with. And we'll save and close. And at this point, you have set up your activity. The other maybe important thing you might want to do is make it visible to your students, which you cannot do until you've added dates. So I'm going to come back in another video, and we'll talk about all these steps to actually get your activity live, to make it visible to students, and then to manage it as they do it. All right, so that's all I have for now. Thank you.